Our world is full of diagrams. Graphic representations of everything from the solar system to the hidden origins of life. They have a unique ability to express complex ideas simply, and an intellectual and artistic beauty that has the power to inspire awe and change our perceptions. In the hands of an influential figure, someone of legendary status, a diagram can also be a brilliant propaganda tool. Florence Nightingale is best known as the Lady of the Lamp, the founder of modern nursing, who cared for thousands of soldiers in appalling conditions during the Crimean War with Russia. What's less well known is that Florence Nightingale was a superb statistician. She was the first to use a statistical graphic as a call to action. In 1857, she created a revolutionary and controversial diagram. It was called the Rose diagram, and it was designed to force the British government to create better and cleaner hospitals. Initially hidden away in the appendix to an official report, this diagram would take on the establishment and win. Its message was potent and direct. Hospitals can kill. But the fascinating thing about Florence Nightingale's diagram is that it also revealed that if the right improvements were made, those mass deaths in hospitals could be avoided. So how did such a simple, pioneering diagram save millions of lives? This is St Thomas's Hospital in London. It was on this site in June 1860 that the Nightingale School of Nursing opened its doors to its first trainee nurses. The school was a direct result of the Crimean War. The thousands of British lives that were lost drove Florence Nightingale to campaign for changes in hospital care that are still relevant today. And the driving force behind that campaign was a graph called the Rose diagram. On the same site as St Thomas's Hospital is the Florence Nightingale Museum, and it's here that one of the most influential diagrams in history is kept. It's no exaggeration to say that the Rose diagram completely changed the British Army's attitude towards medical care, and as a consequence, civilian hospitals changed too. Between 1854 and 1856, Florence Nightingale nursed sick and wounded soldiers at the Scutari Hospital in Turkey, near the Crimean battlefields. After the war had come to an end, she wrote a passionate report on why the soldiers had died in such large numbers. And it revealed an astonishing fact. Out of 18,000 deaths, 16,000 had been due not to wounds in battle, but to infectious diseases in hospital. Florence Nightingale gave her report the title, Notes on Matters Affecting the Health, Efficiency and Hospital Administration of the British Army. Much of it, though, was not published when the Royal Commission prepared their report a year later. It was considered just too controversial. They did, however, publish the diagram. So lots and lots of words here, and numbers and data. Ah, here it is, the diagram. Oh, that's a shame, it's got a tear down the middle. But the colours are really still very vibrant, despite it being published over 150 years ago. And it's clear this is meant to grab the eye first and then start to engage the brain. In fact, Florence Nightingale wrote that the diagram should affect through the eyes what we fail to convey to the brains of the public through their word-proof ears. And what strikes you right at the beginning is this large swathe of blue. And you can see why it's called, they're both called the rose diagrams, because you have this lovely circular effect. That's part of its immediate charm, a rose of many-coloured petals. But it reveals a terrible truth. What the diagram has presented here is the horrific death toll in the Crimean War. On the right-hand rows, we have the battle year 1854-5, with the soldiers' deaths shown for each month, according to the cause of death. And on the left, a smaller diagram shows 1855-6. What matters is the area of each colour. The red areas represent death from wounds. The black, death from other causes, such as frostbite or accidents. But the staggering number of deaths from infectious diseases like dysentery and typhus appear as large blue rose petals bursting out from the centre. The diagram does not provide the number of deaths, but the areas of blue nonetheless create a disturbing impression. As the winter of 1854 advances, they get steadily bigger, until, in January 1855, over 2,500 men dying in a single month. Florence Nightingale accepted that in war, lives are lost during battle. But what she couldn't accept was the far higher number of deaths due to disease. And this diagram on the left illustrates that that need not be the case. Things could change. Apart from a blip in June 1855, the proportion of deaths due to disease is falling and falling. Something had happened to give the soldiers a better chance of survival. The question was, what? This is the first insight into the power of the diagram. Why did the conditions of the soldiers improve so dramatically? And why were there so many fewer deaths from disease in the second year of the Crimean War? To answer that, it's necessary to understand the experience of soldiers during the war, and what Florence Nightingale herself went through. The Crimean War is remembered for its famous battles, in scenes like this one by Richard Caton Woodville, in which the doomed Light Brigade is shown making its fatal cavalry charge on a huge battery of Russian guns. This is the conventional way of depicting war, in paintings, not in diagrams. Death on the battlefield, not in hospital beds. This painting is a heroic piece of army propaganda. But the Crimean was different from previous British wars. The public learned about it from other sources, like newspaper reports, and they didn't like what they heard. Just a few months into the conflict, there was public outrage about the army's neglect of the troops. The Secretary of State for War, Sidney Herbert, was a friend of Florence Nightingale. He knew of her reputation as a progressive and successful superintendent at the establishment for gentlewomen during illness based here in Harley Street. He asked her to recruit a team of nurses to go out to Turkey to run the military hospital in Scutari. When she arrived by ship at Scutari in November 1854, Florence Nightingale faced an enormous challenge.
Florence Nightingale and a team of 38 nurses arrive in Scutari in November 1854. And of course, when she gets there, she finds a vast field of suffering and misery. Soldiers lying on rotting bedding on the floor, packed in like sardines, lack of ventilation, poor sanitation. So in fact, the main hospital at Scutari is constructed over a cesspool. So there are these poisonous gases escaping into the air, feces an inch thick moving across the floor. So when Florence Nightingale opens her office door, she's swimming in it.
And what did she do to improve things when she arrived?
She is the first person, really, in modern British history to treat the common soldier with respect. And what she does is she introduces new standards of hygiene, very importantly, starts washing soldiers' clothes properly with hot water rather than cold water. And she also, very importantly, acts as an unofficial purveyor because there are no proper supplies in the hospital. And so she's going out into the markets in Constantinople buying them. She also introduces new standards of diet, so soldiers are given proper nutritious food.
But it didn't work. Despite her efforts, as the diagram would later show, the death rate continued to rise. The sick and injured received assiduous care from Florence Nightingale and other nurses like Mary Seacole, but nursing wasn't enough. The soldiers went on dying in increasing numbers. Then, just as the first year of the war came to a close, something occurred that would dramatically improve the soldiers' chances of survival and lead Florence Nightingale to a whole new understanding of what was happening in Scutari.
On the 4th of March 1855, these men arrived. This is Dr. John Sutherland, who was a cholera expert, and Robert Rawlinson, who was a sanitary engineer. What wasn't fully appreciated was how putrid the conditions at the hospital at Scutari were. The water system was choked with dead animals, and there was human excrement leaking from the privies into the water tanks. Rawlinson and Sutherland flushed the whole thing out, and then they started to see a difference.
As a result of the Sanitary Commission, as they were called, all the military hospitals rapidly improved. Within 1 month, deaths from infectious diseases had halved. Within a year, they'd fallen by 99%, from well over 2,500 in January 1855 to 42 in January 1856. After the war ended, Florence Nightingale reflected on what she'd experienced over the previous 18 months. She felt desperate about the losses. 18,000 men had died, and she realised that many of them could have been saved. The challenge before her was how could she make lasting improvements in army hospitals so that the same tragedy would never happen again. But persuading the establishment of the urgency of radical reform, she knew wouldn't be easy. Some government officials didn't believe that improving sanitation was the answer to disease. And anyway, for many army chiefs, ordinary soldiers were the scum of the earth.
Florence Nightingale managed to secure an audience with Queen Victoria and her advisors. She tried to impress on them the need for an inquiry into why so many soldiers had died in hospitals during the war. The government and the Queen were not keen to have any more investigations into the war. But public opinion was running high, and Florence Nightingale's reputation was now legendary. So, the government decided to ask her to write a confidential report that would be presented to a new royal commission. She wanted to help out, but what should she write? And more importantly, how could she show the horror and tragedy that she'd seen unfold in Scutari?
The second insight into the success of Florence Nightingale's diagram is its actual design. It was profoundly original, immediately engaging, and crystal clear. But how did she come up with it? In the mid-1800s, using graphs to represent statistical material would have been extremely innovative. So, did it simply pop into her imagination? Or were there other graphs or images she could have drawn on for inspiration? Graphs have been around for over 1,000 years, but they hadn't been much used in the cause of reform. Towards the end of the 18th century, political campaigners and social reformers began to realise the value of statistics, and in particular, visual ways of representing them. Some of the most influential graphs were produced by William Playfair in this book dating to 1786. It's the Commercial and Political Atlas, and it contains 44 graphs. Now, most of them are plotting time against some other value in the kind of familiar XY form, but one of them is slightly different. It's a very early form of bar chart. So here we see exports and imports from Scotland, but now not a graph, but lines representing each of the values. So this is a sort of graph that Florence Nightingale might have seen and considered herself. With the help of the expert statistician William Farr, she'd realised that the principal reason for the deaths at Scutari had not been starvation or bad air, but poor hygiene. And that was what she needed to show in her report, and especially her diagram, however controversial. Farr had sometimes used bar charts in his own work, but that's not what she went for.
Nightingale was afraid that the government would ignore her figures, so the essential facts, her clarion call to action, had to smack them in the eye.
When Florence Nightingale created her diagram in the mid-1850s, Britain was just emerging from an unpopular conflict during which the public had voiced its disapproval of the army's treatment of its troops. For her diagram, it was important that the severity of the problem be conveyed in as visual a way as possible to maximise its impact on decision-makers. The Rose diagram proved hugely effective in informing discussion around the military conflict 150 years ago. I've come to a graphics company to see whether Florence Nightingale's visual approach might similarly contribute to our understanding of the nature of the most recent conflict in Afghanistan and the tragic loss of life there.
What we did was we took information from the first year when the first death occurred, which was 2002, and ran right round to 2010. And what's interesting is you can see that from the years 2006 through to 2010, the amount of troops killed by enemy fire stays relatively constant. But what you do see happening is the statistics here in red for explosions start to really dramatically rise.
I mean, it does look horrific. It does look like...
It's really bad, yeah.
Yeah, it looks like, unfortunately, a very growing spiral trend.
Now, one of the ideas that we'd had for presenting this was we might have included everything as a bar chart, but the huge amount of casualties in, I think it's in 2009, from explosions means that that whole bar chart runs right off the page.
Do you think these kind of diagrams are important today? They were clearly a very useful propaganda tool for Florence Nightingale.
Back then, when Florence did her diagram, obviously, you know, she was aware that the Queen would have a very limited amount of time to make a decision. And, you know, nowadays it's very much the same. I think we were speaking to someone quite recently who said that junior ministers often have 4 minutes to make decisions, which can be, you know, an equivalent of millions and millions of pounds in what they want to fund or what's going to happen.
Or deaths.
Or death occurred.
Yeah, so 4 minutes, you need a very fast way like this.
You need something which will just, you know, grab attention, hopefully, you know, make the viewer want to get more involved with it, but also tell the story as quickly as you can.
Also, the innovation that she showed back then makes it more memorable. It makes someone want to read it and question what is in this data. So hopefully that would have made more of an impact and a lasting impression, which obviously it did, you know, it did its job magnificently.
Seeing the Afghanistan diagram has really brought home to me how powerful a diagram can be when it's portraying something as tragic as the loss of human lives. And the power of Florence Nightingale's diagram works in a similar way. But while the right-hand side of her diagram showed a continuing rise in deaths, the left-hand side of the Rose diagram gives us the key to the way forward. As the blue areas of deaths from infectious diseases get smaller, they show us that change was possible, if only the powers that be would listen. Critics were still trying to find fault with her evidence. Their comments enraged her, and in October 1858, she took the brave decision to leak her report to 100 influential people. Her instinct was to get as much information into the public domain as she could.
Nightingale badgered and petitioned until eventually, 3 months later, the British government approved official publication of a contribution to the sanitary history of the British Army. In it, she named the guilty parties, ridiculed their arguments, and laid out for the British public the glaring truths contained inside the Rose diagram. That the British Army had allowed their military hospitals to become death traps. If they'd been more hygienic, lives would have been saved.
But the final insight into the immense power of the Rose diagram is that it was not just about a historical tragedy. Crucial to its purpose was to point out that lives could be saved and that change was essential. Her diagram ultimately contained a message of hope.
The purpose of this diagram is not actually to convey data so much as to convey a message. The message is we can control epidemic disease. And part of the purpose of this graphic was to convince the public that money spent on sanitation in the cities in Britain would save lives, particularly children's lives. At this time, 50% of urban children were dying before the age of 5. When she published this book, she was lobbying for this kind of public funds to be expended on this kind of improvement here in Britain. And in fact, if I can just read you what she said in here. Let us now ask how it was that our noble army all but perished in the East, and we shall at the same time learn how it has happened that so many hundreds of millions of the human race have by pestilence perished before their time.
So this is a diagram about a battle in the Crimea, but actually this is a weapon in a much huger political battle. Do you think politicians and journalists today could really still learn something from this diagram?
I think so, yes, because in particular, how to convey a message instantly in an emotional sort of way.
Do you think it would be an exaggeration to say that this diagram ultimately saved millions of lives?
No, I don't think that would be an exaggeration at all.
When William Farr, the inveterate statistician, saw the Rose diagram, he disapproved of it. He thought that statistics should be as dry as dust. But the evidence of history is that Florence Nightingale had the right idea. As a result of her work, army medical practice and the care of its troops changed out of all recognition.
Well, the Royal Commission on the Health of the Army brings about a certain number of changes. Firstly, they introduced a new statistical department, so that by the end of the 19th century, the British Army is producing the best statistical material in Europe. They also introduced a new sanitary science department, a restructured Army medical department, and they also ensure that there's proper nutrition for soldiers, so that they are receiving proper food for the first time. The British Army owes an enormous debt to Florence Nightingale because she was regarded as a saviour.
But there's another interesting legacy of the Rose diagram. And it is that campaigners today know that in order to appeal to people's minds, they must first appeal to their eyes.
The truth of this is something that artists have always known about. In a sense, Florence Nightingale and her contemporaries recognised that you could appropriate certain artistic techniques, things like colour or symmetry, to really press home a political or sociological point and effect real change. But what's interesting is that in the 21st century, it's now artists who are appropriating the material of the statistician, things like data and graphs, to create some quite extraordinary works of art.
Ellie Harrison is an artist who, like Florence Nightingale, is fascinated by translating information into compelling images. And she has the same objective: to grab people's attention with a surprising idea, and having got it, to make them think.
How
well do you think Florence Nightingale did with the information that she had and bringing it to life visually?
I think that the diagram that she created is amazing because it is one of the first ever pie charts that existed. So it wasn't like she was dealing with a familiar image at all. It was almost conjuring up something from nothing, which I think is quite remarkable. It really is quite inspirational what she achieved.
Can you tell me about your vending machine?
Yeah, what I tried to do with the vending machine project was to create an artwork that could almost instantaneously react to information, news events that were happening right here, right now. So I worked with a programmer to design a piece of software that would actually scan the news headlines on the BBC RSS feed, looking for search terms that related to the recession. And what happened was every time one of these search terms cropped up, a free packet of crisps would be vended out.
So it's really interesting. You've got this way of marking the term recession. I would probably just do a little peek on a graph or something like that. But for you, lots of the words recession suddenly turns into a huge amount of crisps coming out of the machine.
Exactly. I think what I'm trying to do as an artist is to deal with this kind of contemporary state of information overload. And obviously, since the birth of the internet, there is so much information at our fingertips that I kind of see it as my role to navigate it in some way and then to bring it to life in ways that are very different from how you engage with information on a computer screen or on the TV or in a newspaper.
The beauty of the rose diagram lies in its message of liberation. In its cleverly designed way, it forced the British establishment to recognise that army medical practice couldn't go on as it was, killing off thousands of soldiers unnecessarily. Its strikingly visual appeal won over both hearts and minds and set in motion a process of reform that would change medical care forever.
At first glance, the pleasing combination of colours doesn't give away that this is a hard-hitting statement. But that was part of its success. It captured the imagination, and then the message hit home. It succeeded where words had failed. It turned unpalatable truths into an image that people could not ignore. But it did even more than that, because it offered hope. It promised that better hospitals would actually save thousands of precious lives.
Comedy coming up tonight from 10 with Reggie Perrin. But first, there's a view of Britain from above. Next.